Olivier Corradi, welcome to Only 5 Minutes.
Hello.
Now, electrons can be elusive and their carbon intensity difficult to track. How is electricity maps solving this problem?
Yeah, so what we're doing at Electricity Maps is that we're looking at the whole interconnectedness of the grid in order to figure out where your electricity comes from and how much carbon is emitted in the process. So what we're doing is we're using an algorithm called flow tracing that looks at where your electricity comes from. It can either be generated locally, but it can also be imported from a neighboring country, which might itself also import from another place, which means that we need to look at the whole interconnectivity of the grid. And we do that, every hour of the year, everywhere in the world, in order to be able to account very accurately for where your electricity physically comes from.
The Greenhouse Gas Protocol recently released its guidance for Scope 2 emissions, the emissions we're largely talking about. What does that mean for the transition to renewables and specifically for the solar industry?
Yeah, so what we're seeing is that the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is facing what I think is a credibility crisis, because most companies currently in the world, when they're tracking their carbon emissions on electricity, what they're doing is that they're looking at it on a yearly level. So they're looking at where does my electricity come from? But if you only look at it on the yearly level, you can end up misrepresenting the physical origin of electricity. So for example, you mentioned the solar industry. You can actually say that you're powered by solar electricity when you're consuming it during the night, because we're not looking at the physics in the system. We're not looking at the system in real time. And there's a second piece as well, where you can claim to have used electricity from a disconnected grid where there's no physical interconnection. So I think the real challenge the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is facing is to be able to have a credible and true representation of where your electricity physically comes from. And that is particularly important in the energy transition, because we want to make sure that any action a company is taking actually is reflected with a real world reduction in carbon emissions. And the only way you do that is if you can realistically and precisely track the physics of what's happening, because then all your actions will necessarily translate into impact if you have adequately modeled emissions and where they come from.
Another big driver, especially in Europe, is energy independence. Has Russia's invasion of Ukraine driven a new urgency towards granular accounting?
Yeah, so what we've seen is that with the current energy crisis that Europe is facing, is that there's an increased, challenge in how energy markets are built and how we're actually tracking not only the origin of electricity, but how the markets are pricing these assets. And especially since the gas prices are setting the prices of electricity in Europe, we're seeing a lot of debates currently happening about how these markets should operate. And I believe that there's a very large opportunity now to align, your electricity costs with the emissions tied to your electricity usage. And what we're seeing is now that even the carbon price has been rising in Europe as a result of all these effects, which basically means in a nutshell that we will be aligning your operational costs with your emissions. So again, maybe to say it in a different perspective, we have a unique opportunity now in order to make sure that we're utilizing electricity at the right time, for example, when renewables are abundant. And that is a good way to reduce your costs and also to reduce carbon emissions. So you might say it's a blessing in disguise.
24/7 granular accounting is being driven by tech giants like Google. How does Electricity Maps serve these big consumers?
Yes, we are working with a variety of thought leaders in the industry in order to showcase what the next generation of accurate carbon reporting is going to be. We're working, for example, with Google, but there's other companies that we're working with, both in order to make sure that in their sustainability reporting, they're accurately reflecting where the electricity is coming from with this physical credibility that I talked about before. And we also want to enable companies to make the optimal decisions in order to drive the decarbonization of the grid in the best setting. And finally, we're also working with various companies that are building consumer applications, energy retailers, smart electric vehicle charging operators, to make sure that this actionability is also given to end consumers. Because in the end, it's great large companies are doing something. It's also great if we can all play a part in the energy transition, for example, by making sure that as consumers, we're pushing or asking for the solutions that can help us use electricity at the right time. I would love if my electric vehicle, for example, could charge when the renewables are plentiful and not, you know, in a dumb way, just charge when electricity, when I just plug it in. So this is a huge opportunity in my perspective.
Olivier, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me here.